Use your imagination for a moment. And I want you to imagine Moses in Horeb, the remote part of the desert. It's dry and it's hot. And he's standing there with the sheep, his father-in-law's sheep and goats. This is Jethro's farm. And there's really nothing special about the region. The environment is just scrub and dirt. And these animals are wandering across the land, and they're nibbling at different plants and just doing what animals do, stomping around the dirt, maybe nibbling at the bushes. And then Moses looks over, and off in the distance, maybe a place he had just been with those sheep and goats, he looks over and he sees a bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And he turns towards the bush, and as he does, God calls to him and tells Moses to stop what he's doing and to first take off his sandals, take off his shoes. Because the place where he's standing, God calls holy ground. Now I want you to consider the context of Moses actually hearing that statement from God. Moments before, and maybe within an hour before, hearing God, it may very well be that at that bush, the very bush that's now on fire, Moses' animals were walking by and nibbling at that bush and stomping around the dirt around that bush and doing all the things animals do. And I'm asking you to use your imagination here. I won't be more specific than that. But Moses now is required to stop and take off his shoes because in his culture, and by the way, this is true still in many Oriental cultures, that when you enter into the presence of God or a God, you take off your shoes. Before God arrives on the scene, the bush is common. It's just a bush. This is just like any other bush. But after God arrives, the place is now consecrated. It's set apart. We call it holy. And the biblical principle is that any space where God is automatically is holy ground. And I think this is so important for our understanding of church worship that it's actually difficult to overstate. It would be hard for me to oversell this. If God is present, then that place where it might have once been common or ordinary, possibly even corrupt, is fundamentally altered by His presence. Going out 40 toward Winston-Salem, about halfway, around Hillsborough, maybe up past there toward Mebane. There was what was called a gentleman's club. In fact, they used to have street signs, big billboards, and I always felt a little bit of sadness in my heart when I saw the ladies on the billboard. They looked sad. They looked angry and sad. I don't know if that was on purpose. I don't think so. I don't know where they got the stock photos or if these were some of the people that were involved in this business. But obviously, this is not the kind of business that people should be doing. It's immoral and wicked. And you would drive by that place and you'd look off to your left and there was the building where this kind of activity was. Actually, the owner of the building, a few years after he built it, was involved in some drugs. Kind of hard to believe that one vice and another vice might actually go together. But he was involved in selling drugs out of the back of that business, and he was arrested, put in jail. The business ended up going under. And what I found to be especially ironic and amusing to me is that because the building was empty, what ended up in that building was a church. And where you once had a corrupt place, You now have a consecrated place. By the way, that church has since moved on. The building has been razed. It's gone. But I think that we should consider consecration this way, because God promises to be present wherever His people gather. Church gathering places are consecrated to God. This is God's place. It's not ours. It's not owned by any person. And it really isn't even our church's place. It's God's. He owns it. He paid for it. It's His place. And this transformation, I think, is most evident in church planting, where you find these church plants using non-church facilities for worship. It may be like a place that's a barber shop on a Saturday, and on Sunday it's a church. Or one church plant, early before I was a pastor, I was looking at a church planting opportunity around Virginia Beach area. My wife and I were newly married, and we went there, and I preached there on a Sunday. I was in my mid to late 20s, and that church met in the mall's food court there in that area. And for that period of time, that was God's place. You start thinking of all the places church plants meet: furniture stores, bank buildings, funeral homes. Our missionary in Queens, Tim Richmond, his church meets in the auditorium in the building of a false church, a cult, actually. Church of Science, Christian Science. They actually have to put up banners over the sayings that are on the wall, because the sayings are anti-Christian, anti-Christ. And here he is on Sunday, beautiful, beautiful building. And after this Christian Science church meets, where they have their 8 or 9 people, sometimes a high of 15, Tim brings in his church. They get there around 1 o'clock, I want to say. And they have their church service, their worship service. And now you have 90, 100 people sitting in this building singing praises to God. And the church is fundamentally altered. It's different. It's now from a place hours earlier, satanic, to being a place of God's presence. And I think that's really important for us to understand. What makes a place holy is not the atmosphere created by the architecture, by stained glass, or the acoustical effect of the auditorium. I don't know if you've ever been up to Durham and been in Duke Chapel. It's a beautiful building. This Gothic building. You walk in, it's just incredible. And all that's there, none of that's holiness. None of that is godliness. It's just a building. It's a beautiful building, but it's not a holy building. You can walk into a barn, and if that's where God's people are meeting, that's a holy place. And I think holiness is not a contrived effect. It doesn't necessarily arrive because you feel holy. In fact, I think at times we use the word inaccurately, because what we think is holy is not holy. It's just solemn. You take, for example, a battlefield. You go to Gettysburg and you read the Gettysburg Address, and what does Lincoln say? And I'm not denigrating Abraham Lincoln, although I'm a Southern boy. I'm not denigrating Lincoln, who said, "We cannot hallow this ground. It was for the dead who are here to hallow the ground." They didn't hallow that ground. There's nothing holy about that place. It's solemn. Many men lost their lives at Gettysburg, but it's not a holy place. There's nothing holy about it, because holy places are where God is. And I don't necessarily believe God is present at Gettysburg all the time. And I'm not saying God isn't omnipresent. I'm just saying in the sense of He is being worshipped. I think a church signals one of its chief purposes in gathering together is to meet with God and to worship Him. And when the church meets, the location where it meets is considered consecrated. And as long as God's people are meeting there for the purpose of worshiping Him, that place is consecrated to God. Anything set apart to God is holy. It's consecrated. It's sacred. So let's think about things. I want to give you 3 ways to think about things. And maybe you've never done this before, but I think this will be very helpful for you. I think there are 3 ways we can think of physical things. Things that can be consecrated, they can be common, or they can be corrupt. That is, those things can actually be set apart to God, or they can just be neutral things, have nothing to do with Him, or they can be actually things used against God, violating His moral or ethical code. So let's talk about consecrated things. Consecration is the idea of declaring something to be sacred, set apart to God, holy to God. It involves that sense of holiness and purity. You think of that word sacred for just a moment. It's from an Indo-European word, sak, and it's derived from the Latin sacer, meaning holy or dedicated. And there are a whole bunch of English words that start with that 4-letter root. You ever think about it? You've got things like sacrilege, or sacrosanct, or sacrifice. The Oxford Dictionary defines sacred as connected with God or a god, or dedicated to a religious purpose and so deserving veneration. And some of the synonyms of this word give us a fuller look at its meaning, something like cherished or revered, religious, blessed, consecrated, divine, solemn. That gives you a better sense of when we use the word sacred, kind of what we're meaning there. Likewise, some of the antonyms of sacred: blasphemy, irreverence, dishonor, cursed. These provide us a pretty well-rounded understanding of what we mean by the word sacred. It has a linguistic connection with the Old Testament word holy, kadosh, and the New Testament equivalent of holy, which is hagios. In fact, have you ever heard the word hagiography? When a writer is telling you a story about a guy who lived 100 years ago and all he's doing is praising him. You call it hagiography. He's making him saintly. He's not telling the bad, he's only telling the good. That's hagiography. That's hagios. That's saintly. That's sacred. That's holy. In the Old Testament, sacred things were those things set apart to God, hallowed to Him, consecrated. And a general scan of the numerous verses using that term reveals that it could be an individual, like a priest. He could be set apart to God, or a special place, like the tabernacle or the temple, that was set apart to God, or even a special day. A Sabbath is a day set apart to God, or an assembly on a special day. In the New Testament, sacred or consecrated was used in a more ethical sense. It's dealing less with a place and more with a sense of separation from worldliness. And of course, both Testaments, the most common usage is in reference to God. He is holy. When we talk about holiness, that's usually what we're referring to. Christians are supposed to be consecrated to God, and that's a very familiar verse, Romans 12, verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies, you consecrate your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Everything having to do with God, the Christian life, is to be consecrated to Him. It's to be sacred. If something is used for God's work, it should be considered consecrated. Do we all understand that? It's God's. It's holy. Now, there are things that are common. And I think this is probably the most interesting of the 3 categories, because we don't think about common things maybe the way we should. The things that are not set apart to God are common. We could call them secular. And it doesn't mean that they're evil. Common things are things which have no real spiritual significance. What color socks do you have on? Is there holiness in those socks? Are they your consecrated socks? I set apart these socks to God. My brown socks, no, but my blue socks, yes. They're my holy socks. I think the clothing of Jesus was not sacred. When Notre Dame burned recently, apparently one of the priests ran into the temple there, ran into the church, and rescued the crown of thorns. Did you read about this? They actually believe that they have the crown of thorns that Jesus wore on his head at the time of his crucifixion. Now, they can only trace this ring of thorns back to about the 4th century, 6th to 4th century. And before that, they have no ability to understand where it came from. There's no provenance before the 4th century. So they're just saying this is the crown of thorns. But even if it was the crown of thorns, would it be holy? Now, would it be neat? If you could say, this is the cross of Jesus, here it is. This is the wood on which Jesus was crucified. Would that be neat? Would we all agree that's pretty cool? That'd be really neat. Would it be holy? Would there be something special about it in the sense that these are the clothes of Jesus? It's just common. Jesus didn't consider his clothing to be holy. It was clothes. People wear clothes. Jesus wore clothes. Secular things are common things of life. They are temporary things. And they don't have the same value as those that are considered sacred by God. I think for a moment we need to stop and realize that there is a sense in which while this place is holy to God, it's only holy to God because we designate it as our worship space. If we sold the building to a Wendy's, would that be evil? Would all of a sudden the plaster and the lights become unholy? Because now they've got the world's best hamburgers, according to them, being made? Would it be better or worse? You see, it just becomes common. It's not necessarily evil, unless you think hamburgers are evil. Temporary things that aren't considered sacred by God. Do you realize this is the point? The burning bush was just a shrub. It was just a shrub, meaningless and unimportant until it began to burn with God's presence. And then it was holy. And there's nothing sinful about common things. Secular doesn't mean worldly. If a lamb is set apart to God in a sacrifice, that lamb was holy. But what do you think about all the other lambs in the flock? Okay, all right, you're the good lamb. We're going to put you aside. You're the holy lamb. By the way, that means we get to slaughter you. And you slaughter all the lambs because you give one in sacrifice, you're going to eat it. And then what do you think you do with the other lambs? You know, you're not just caring for them because you love lambs. You're going to eat them at some point. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, children, but that's kind of what you do. Where do you think you get all that food from the supermarket? You know, let your parents explain that to you. But there's nothing unholy about the other lambs just because the one lamb is holy. It's just they're common. And there's a sense in which the common things of our life are influenced by God. So I think even though they're common things, we have to realize that if we own them as believers, even though they're common things, they're to be used for God's pleasure. And so I wouldn't call them sacred. But I will still say that God has rule over them. My house is not a holy house, but it is God's in the sense that if He wants it, He can take it. It's mine in the sense of human ownership, but God paid for that house. It's God's place. And it's just a house. I think it's true for everything we have. So the offerings we give to the Lord, that in the terms of a crops, they would give the first fruits of the crops to the Lord. Those were holy. They were devoted. They were harem. That was the Hebrew word for devoted things. Devoted to the Lord. But the rest of their crops were not strictly sacred, but they were still governed by Jewish laws. And I think for a Christian, every part of life is voluntarily submitted to God. So, okay, Lord, you have everything. But what is God's is what's holy. And then there are corrupt things. These are things that are inherently bad. They're inherently sinful. They are profane. That Old Testament word profane, chalal, refers to things that are polluted and defiled. You get the story of Reuben. That word is used in that story between Reuben and Bilhah. We have, interestingly enough, if they would take rocks, they were to use rocks that had never been cut before when they built altars. When they built an altar to God, it had to be uncut rocks. If they cut the rocks, they defiled the rocks. God said, I want you to use stones that have never been cut to build my altar. These are corrupt things. And I think here we're talking about things that are wicked or lawless or unholy. And by the way, you say, but how can a rock be unholy? Because God designated it that way. So anything where God's law says this is wrong, it's wrong. If we were living in the day when manna was there, you say you have to go collect manna 6 days out of the week, and on the 6th day you would collect it twice, and on the 7th day you wouldn't collect it all. So on Friday you go out, you get twice the amount of manna, and then on Saturday you would have no manna, and then you start the cycle again on Sunday. So that holy day, that Sabbath day, was God's day. It was given to Him. The other days were not. But there was something special about that Friday. And when you went and collected that, if you said, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go out and try to get manna on the Sabbath day. You were now trying to violate God's command. And you say, but what's wrong with going and collecting sticks on a Saturday? Well, nothing, except God said don't do it. And because God said don't do it, it becomes inherently wrong. You see, things that are holy are lawless. They have no law. Now, I think we understand those three categories. Does anybody have a question about those? We'll quickly answer them if you don't. If you don't have a question, I'm not going to answer any questions, but ask them anyway. Anybody have a question? Okay, let's move on. The church, then, is consecrated to God. You have the three categories. You have consecrated, you have common, you have corrupt. The church is consecrated to God. And now we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and the Apostle Paul asked the believers in Corinth if they're aware that their church is a temple of the Lord. Look at verse 16. Know you not that you are the temple of God. And that is not talking about their bodies. That's chapter 6. And people get these confused. They think of their bodies, they take chapter 6 as being the temple of God, and they don't understand that in chapter 3 it's talking about the church of Corinth. It's a church that's the temple of God as well. The Spirit of God indwells the church, and if any man defile God's temple, him God will destroy, because the temple of God is what? What does it say? The church is holy to the Lord. It's set apart to God. And he says, you are God's temple. And when we talk about a temple, we don't mean a temple in the sense of a building through which we worship God. It was the place where God would come and bring His presence. And he says, you, the church of Corinth, are the temple of God. It's the word naos in the New Testament. It draws their attention to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a location they would have recognized as one of the holiest places on earth. And Paul's reason then for writing this is to explain that God's Holy Spirit not only indwells individual believers, that's chapter 6, but in some manner He also indwells the church as a whole. So the Corinthian church is holy to the Lord. The church is holy. Brian? Yes. So not the building. The building is holy in the sense that this is where we are meeting as a church, but only in that sense. It doesn't have inherent holiness. It's just brick and paint. But where the church gathers, so it could be, once again, going back, it could be like in a church plant. It could be a bank. It could be a barber shop. And when the church gathers there, it becomes a holy place. So the moment the church leaves and people begin cutting hair, then hair falls everywhere. Then it's not holy any longer. It's just common. And it could even be a corrupt place. But where God is, it becomes holy. And he says, so where the Holy Spirit is indwelling, that place is holy. And I think that's really important to understand because if someone defiles a church, do you see that? He says, if you defile a church, what will God do to you? By the way, it's the same word. That word destroy and the word defile are the same word. You defile a church, God's going to defile you. That's pretty harsh, don't you think? That's pretty strong. Can we all just admit that that's really strong? You go back and you read those passages in Revelation 2 and 3, and you think about what Jesus is saying to the pastors of those churches. If you will not change, I will end you as a church. I will stop this ministry. Do you think about what Paul writes to the Roman believers? He says, don't you think for a moment that because Israel has been cut off temporarily, that you're in a position where you can never be cut off. He says, I can cut you off. If I cut them off, I can cut you off. And so we should say, I don't want to defile anything of God's. God's people must consider themselves and their church to be holy before the Lord. This is non-negotiable. I love Isaac Watts' hymn, how sweet and awful is the place where Christ within the doors. You get that? You understand what he says there? It's a sweet place, isn't it? When a church meets, it's beautiful. It's the beauty of holiness. That's the expression in the Old Testament where God's people gather. It's the beauty of holiness. It's not the cathedral. It's not the stained glass. That's that feeling of solemnity. It's the beautiful place because Christ is within the doors, while everlasting love displays the choicest of her stores. The best that love can give is found where Christ is exalted in that church. Outside the doors of a church, there can be Sodom and Gomorrah. And in some churches, that's really true. I mean, you have Sodom and Gomorrah right outside the doors. And you have a little bit of glass or a little bit of brick, and then inside the place is the place where God is gathered with his people. And within the doors is the sweet and awful, or when we say awful, we mean awesome place. In this life, God's domain and Satan's may be separated by a thin piece of glass, but they must remain separated. Can I just say to you, this is what I can't overstate. They have to remain separated. In every dispensation, God's people have been called to be holy, to be separate from the world. Israel was called to be different from the nations around her. They were to worship God and serve God alone, unlike the pagan nations of the world. They were a kingdom of priests, a holy people, a light to the Gentiles. And by the way, that's the same language Peter uses of the church in 1 Peter. You're a holy priesthood. You're a set-apart people, peculiar, different. And one of the main points of emphasis by the Old Testament prophets is that Israel failed in their task. And likewise, the church is a kingdom of priests, a holy people, a light to the world, set apart and called to a life of holiness. The gathering of God's people must be different from other assemblies in the rest of the world. This is fundamentally the problem. This is it. This is where we have a major disagreement with many of our evangelical brethren who are willing to bring into the church things that are common, or even worse, things that are corrupt, because those things are magnets for unbelievers. And then they look at the size of their congregation and say, look what God is doing. That is really horrible. Really bad. We have to be different from other assemblies in the rest of the world. The church must consider its assembly as a sacred hour. We talked in the previous lesson about the importance of gathering together. Now we're talking about when we're gathered together, what is that hour? It's a sacred time. It's God's time. Like Moses at the bush, it's no time to be wearing shoes, as it were. It's God's. The sacred activities of our worship should be performed in a sacred manner with an appropriate spirit. This is why silliness really has no place in worship. I'm not saying there can't be humor, but silliness has no place. Folly has no place. And I think that, and we'll talk about this in a moment, that there's a sense of, some people think holiness is just being sad, and I like the word dour. Just, life is horrible and black. I have to wear black all the time and really look sad. But the opposite of that is to look silly, to make everything a joke. So let's talk about what corrupts a church. If I asked you, what do you think corrupts a church? I think most Christians would probably respond by naming a gross sin on the part of its leaders or some evil tolerated by the congregation, and I do not doubt that that does defile a church. But I think here the very first warning is the area of doctrinal corruption. He states that the church, as the church planter of Corinth, you see that back in chapter 3, verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. Who's the planter of the church? Paul is. And verse 10, he says, I am an architect. I'm the master builder. I'm the great architect. I laid the foundation. He was the one who sketched out the blueprints of the church of Corinth. And he laid the foundation, which was, verse 11, what? What is the foundation of that church? It was the doctrine of Jesus Christ. And then he says, all right, now I planted the church. I laid the foundation of Jesus. You need to build upon that church things that are good. And he uses three precious things as metaphors for doctrinal truth: gold, silver, precious stones. And then he uses three things that are non-doctrinal truth: wood, hay, and stubble. And is there anything evil about wood, hay, and stubble? No. The problem is it just burns up. He says, you build upon your foundation using worthless materials. These are metaphors for bad or false doctrine, or even for no doctrine. If you have a church that just kind of plays around with Scripture, I hear this all the time. I was sitting in another church, thank the Lord it wasn't here, and I was listening to a preacher preach, and the audience was laughing and clapping, and it was funny. It was funny, but it had nothing to do with the Bible. I was sitting there thinking to myself, wow, this is a great sermon, but it has nothing to do with the text at all. And all of his applications were wrong. His exegesis was wrong. Everything was wrong. And if he was in one of my classes, I would have given him an F. But people were applauding him and laughing and nodding. Oh, that's so good. And I'm thinking, if that's what he's doing in his church, it is wood and it is hay and it is stubble. And friends, we have to be really serious about that. Sometimes gold, silver, and precious stones is boring and dry. But it's what lasts. Now, there's a second kind of corruption. Look over at chapter 5. This is moral corruption. The Corinthian church was not only tolerating doctrinal corruption, they were being corrupted by moral corruption, which is just as dirty. Our culture celebrates gross sin. Lewdness, pornography, adultery, sexual violence, humor, double entendre are all part of the fabric of our society. And the consequence of this culture is we've accepted these various sins as being okay. The people who engage in such behavior, they consider themselves to be morally good people. Do you realize one of the things we're doing as a church is we are turning off the lights in our culture? When we fail to say to our culture, this is wrong. There's a man running for the presidency. He's a mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Do you know who this guy is? Have you had any contact with him? Know who I'm talking about? He is a grossly immoral man. Wicked. Very, very wicked man. I'm not saying that we have other leaders who aren't wicked, but this man is living in a grossly immoral lifestyle presently. And I was on a business social media site that I'm involved with. And a friend of mine from high school, actually we grew up together. He went to the same Christian school that I did all the way through college. I've known this guy all my life. And there was a picture of this guy running for president sitting on a subway in New York City. And there was somebody took his photo. The guy didn't know it, took his photo and said, how cool is it that I'm riding on the subway? And it was just posted on this site, and my friend liked it. And my first thought is, what in the world are you doing? Even if you don't agree with this lifestyle, what have you just done? You're supposed to be a believer. Your dad was an evangelist, a preacher of the gospel. We're turning off the lights on our culture. They think that because we are saying it's okay to live this way, that it's okay to live this way. And it's not. It's moral corruption. And worse, we bring it into the church. The internet, a major part of Americans' daily life. And I was on my way home today, and my wife had been talking to one of our church ladies, and the comments were made, it would be better if cell phones had never been invented. And there's a part of me that agrees with that. A part of me. I think there's some advantages to those things, but there's some real dangers to those things. 68 million internet searches involve immorality every day. 68 million. The Bible says the believer's body is sacred to God. It should be considered a living sacrifice. Paul reminds the Corinthians their bodies are the temples of the indwelling Holy Spirit, 1 Corinthians 6:19. When Christians engage in these kinds of behaviors, they bring their moral corruption into their church. Now, before we go overboard, because some people, they hear something like this and they go, okay, now I know what we need to do. We've got to create all these really rigid rules. And what they do is they erect the edifice of formalism, and they confuse formalism with sacred. Some believers are unaware of what consecrated means, and so they confuse formalism with holiness. And it's true that sacred activities should be approached in a somewhat formal manner. God is not pleased by a flippant attitude as we worship Him. But there is a difference between approaching God with a sacred spirit and acting or dressing up in a formalistic way. One is worshipful expression of the heart, but the other one's just tradition. It's just tradition. Some Christians are often by extension their churches, make the mistake of thinking that they are not defiling God's sacred space because of their traditions. They're not thinking about doctrinal defilement, and they're not thinking about moral defilement. They're thinking about some sort of cultural, traditional defilement. You see, they've erected this edifice, and they say, okay, anything that violates these series of rules that I've created, somehow that now becomes the standard by which defilement is judged and determined. And I'll just tell you where that is. It's most often located in those cultural things. And because our world is getting smaller, we have cultures that are clashing, and it's creating lots of really good questions for Christians. We're having to answer them. You go to the Philippines. We had a missionary to the Philippines last Sunday. Godly man, has a seminary there. Churches have been planted out of their church that he started. It's just a great ministry. And I was talking to him. I said, how do you like being in the States? And his children, we were all out having dinner afterward. And then I said, it's really hot in the Philippines. And I would love to minister in the Philippines, but it's so hot. We were joking about that. And I was saying, basically, if I could just take air conditioning with me everywhere I went in the Philippines, I'd be really happy. Somebody can make some sort of air-conditioned suit because it's just so hot and so humid all the time. They have a hot season, and then they have a really hot season. That's the Philippines, okay? When I was teaching over there, Becky bought me this thing that you put water in, and then you run it through the air, and then you put it around your neck to cool off. And it wasn't as wet as the rest of me. It was so humid. My clothes were you're just kind of standing there a little bit. Even my fingers were hot. You're just so hot. So hot. And I'm talking to this guy about it. And he says, well, that's why we don't wear a suit. They wear a shirt that's untucked for ventilation, and it's short-sleeved, and they have a name for it. Now, he said it, and I've heard it before, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. But he says that's what we wear to church. And it looks different from what they wear the other parts of the day. They wear that to say we're dressing up, we're approaching God formally. But it doesn't look like what we would wear in our culture. Is there anything wrong with that? No. Not at all. But at the same time, formalism is not worship. It does not exalt God. It replaces the right spirit of worship with some man-made cultural standard, usually of a bygone era. And it ends up just going through the motions of so-called worship. Moses took off his sandals, not because taking off your sandals makes you more godly. It was because God said, take off your shoes. Because in that culture, that's what you did when you approached God in worship. God expects the same spirit in Moses' heart. It was the act, not of removing his sandals, but in his heart of saying, I'm going to be in obedience to the Lord. That heart of submission and obedience is what God desires. It's what God wants. Now you say, Pastor, what are all those? Explain to me then all the cultural ramifications of this. I'm not going to do that. We could spend weeks going through those. And I will tell you that you may have an idea, and I may have an idea, and we're not going to always meet in total agreement. The point is that we're trying. We're actually saying our desire together is to come up with the right answer for our culture of what it means to exalt God in worship in a holy way. Not what makes everybody feel more comfortable necessarily or pleased or in pleasure to be here. See, what God desires for His church is that we take off our shoes in our hearts. That this is a consecrated place. And I think the only way that ever happens is if we as people realize that where God is present, we have to recognize His presence and then recognize that that place is holy to God. Now, Elizabeth Barrett Browning in her poem Aurora Lee, she's not really exactly saying what I'm saying here, but I love the way she writes this poem because I think it really draws attention to the difference between people who are aware of what I'm talking about and people who are not. People who are aware of the importance of having this sense of a sacred atmosphere and people who are not. Here's what she writes. Speaking of sensual things, not evil, but things you can touch with your sensual means using your senses. And spiritual things, the things you can't touch. Here's what she writes. Earth's crammed with heaven. Heaven's everywhere. God is everywhere. Go to the Grand Canyon. Wow, look what God made. Earth's crammed with heaven. Every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest just sit around and pluck blackberries. And the blackberry, of course, because when it's in season, you look at it with the sun shining on it, you say it looks like a bush that's on fire. And I think the point of my using that as a conclusion is to say this. We have to be people who in our hearts say, here is God's place. Where we gather together, it's God's place. In our hearts, let's take off our shoes. Let's recognize this is sacred to the Lord. Now, I have 3 personal application questions. When you approach God, do you consider that a sacred moment? Is God just your buddy, your pal, your friend, confidant? Or is He more than that? He is your friend, but is He more than that? Do you confuse holy things with solemn things? Is a cemetery holy? Why? If it is, why? Do you see doctrinal corruption on par with moral corruption? And then I have some discipleship questions. What makes a space holy and why? What is the difference between consecrated and common things? Is God honored by common things? How important is right doctrine in the life of a church? How can we ensure right doctrine in our church? That's really important. And then how does formalism get confused for consecration? Okay? Any questions before we